Welcome to question 94 of the Secunda Secundae. The topic for this lesson is idolatry, and I am Dr. Thibault. Now, idolatry fits under the classification of the cardinal virtue of justice under the potential part of justice called religion, which is itself a virtue trying to give God what is due. And now we're looking at vices of the virtue of religion, of which is superstition, which is an excess of religious devotion and not to proper mode of worship. And the particular topic we're covering today is idolatry. So we already did undue worship, which is worshiping the true God, but in the wrong way. This is to not worship the true God at all, to worship something which is not the true God. And then we will get eventually into the deficiencies of the virtue of religion. Those will be future videos. So idolatry is a species of superstition. So superstition is the vice associated with the excess of religion. Of superstition, there are parts of superstition, species of the family of superstition. Of those are one of them is idolatry. So divine worship should be given to the Most High, uncreated God alone. That quote from St. Thomas. So divine worship should be given to the Most High, uncreated God alone. So any worship other than to the uncreated God would then be some form of idolatry. Worship takes place in a sensible form. Worship is an external act. Therefore, idols are also a sensible form. So in some ways, you are performing a sensible form of action to a sensible form. You are giving to create. You are using creation to bless a piece of creation. In some ways, it's contradictory. Some idols, St. Thomas talks about, is nefarious art, which is produced by the power of the demons. These idols, right? An idol would be something which is worshipped, divinely worshipped, but is a act of a creature. Some of these creatures, for example, if you had a lion, for example, we'll get into animals later on, but lion, for example, demons could convince an artist to make a depiction of the lion for nefarious purposes, for idolatry, to distract one from God. So the lion isn't bad in itself, but the person who created the image of it could have been inspired by demonic powers in order to divert proper worship to the true God, to divert the attention to a false object. So idolatry is the worship and service to the creature rather than to the creator. Now, idolatry never quite goes away, and it certainly doesn't now. Well, a bit of the "I'm spiritual, not religious" movement. I know we've moved to the point where younger people are not neither religious nor spiritual, as they self-define, but has this idea of, well, God is in creation, therefore you worship creation, right? And don't go to the church, right? Church is a man-made institution. I'm getting in the mind of others. Church is a man-made institution, therefore, worship creation where God is. Well, there's a problem with this. We don't worship the church building anymore. That we worship God alone. That's the first part response to that. And the second is it is important to seek God in creation. Very good, right? St. Thomas, very Franciscan approach to see God in creation. But very incarnational, right? See God in creation, but we do not worship the creation. We worship the Creator. Um, distinction. Uh, the term idolatry, I jumped ahead for this one into response to the objections. Um, the term idolatry was used to signify any worship of a creature, even without the use of an image. So idols are typically images, right? They're typically that we call them creatures, but that means part of creation. A creature is part of creation. So whether it's a human being or an animal or an object, those are all matters of all creatures. Um, but there are non-physical idols as well, and this could be uh, wealth, power, honor, uh, be another one, right? Lust, right? These types of things, these types of vices could be idols in an immaterial sense, right? Power and wealth, immaterial in terms of what you hope to achieve. Honor, right? It's not that you're worshiping a statue which represents honor, it's that you are seeking honor above all else. That can also become an idol, form of superstition, right? Putting the wrong emphasis. So the reverence should be to God, not the reverence towards the idea of honor. Uh, the theology of idols. Now, this is from St. Thomas's words, and I think they are good words. Maybe a contemporary theologian would kind of frame it this way, but St. Thomas, I think, does a very good job of doing this. Uh, there's this idea of natural theology, which, why do people create idols? How do people end up in idolatry? Well, there's an element of natural theology, which is this idea that um, divine worship ought to be given to the whole world. So if God created the world, God is in the world, God is the world, there is only the one. This is going back to Zeno, right? Going back to some of the pre-Socratic philosophers. All there is the one. It's all one. God, us, the universe, everything is the one. Therefore, this type of pantheism. Since God is all is the one, then really it doesn't matter the difference between the Eucharist and my black rock, which I keep bringing up. No difference. God is in the one, right? My finger or is no different than the rock, right? The river is no different than the mountain. The church is no different than anything else. Everything is the one. So because of that, everything can be worshipped. This kind of pantheism. Second would be, and I'll add, that might not be that different than a lot of people's spiritual beliefs today. So goes way back to the pre-Socratics, and it goes through the Middle Ages, and here it is, still here. So some things don't change. The other one is the spiritual hierarchy demands worship, which is part of the Platonist movement. You could see this, and I'm not going to say Pseudo-Dionysius was part of this, but you can see this in the writings of the Pseudo-Dionysius with the celestial hierarchy. Now, people could take something like that celestial hierarchy and use it incorrectly. So if you say, well, there's the hierarchy of heaven, above us, the angels, and you have the saints, and you have the martyrs, and you have the virgins, and you have the powers and the principalities, all the way up to God. Well, the higher up you are in the chain, the more like God they are. Therefore, we should reverence those superior to us because of uh, their more godliness approach. Right? There's misforming of the exodus, reditus, right? That's emanation of the one, as we see in Plato, the emanation of the one, right? The closer you get to the one, the more you could reverence. Well, yes and no, right? maybe the greater honor you give to one, right? The saints who are kneeling before the altar of God maybe deserve great honor, dulia, hyperdulia for the Blessed Mother, but it's not reverence, right? That chasm between God and all of the other spiritual beings is a great chasm, right? It is not a gray area, right? The difference between one choir of angels and another choir of angels may be uh, marginal, right? It may be to a degree, one is greater than the other, right? How much the difference between archangels and angels is to the degree that they are great, whereas the difference between an archangel and God himself is a giant chasm which can never be crossed. Right? The difference between a saint and the Blessed Mother, dulia and hyperdulia, is still dealing with dulia. We're still dealing with sweetness. The chasm between the Blessed Mother and the Trinity is a chasm which cannot be passed in terms of reverence and devotion. It's to a whole nother degree. Now, if you just look at a pyramid of a hierarchy, they might look like, well, at the top is God and everything else is some degree below it. But really, it's considerably different, right? Considerably different. And it's not to pull anything down, but it's just that God is so great within his essence that man is nowhere near it. None of creation is near it. Not even the angels are close to it. So that could be it. If you're honoring angels or celestial beings too much, if you're reverencing them, you're giving latria to them, the highest form of worship, then you've missed it. You've missed what the hierarchy is about. Now, there's also a mystical theology, which St. Thomas points to as people's understanding of men, and he specifically points out poets, right? I think particularly he's looking at the people like the Caesars of the world, Julius Caesar, Augustus, some of these. The poets are writing about their military prowess, their conquering of the world, and they're divinizing them. They're turning them into gods through their poetry, right? And then we have statues made of the Caesars, and people adore them with flowers, and they light incense before them. And, they honor the statue wherever it goes. It is treated as an idol because of the artistic attempt to idolize, right? To turn the politician into an idol. So this would be mythical theology, which it would be, again, wrong. Idolatry. And the last one is civil theology, which ties in with the mythical theology. Um, it's he talks about the pontiffs in the temple, and he's not talking about the Pope, he's talking about politicians in the temple. And first I thought it was really just speaking specifically about people again, right? If you go down to Washington, D.C., you see pantheons and all types of temples. They look like Greek temples in Washington, D.C., and who's inside of it? Uh, George Washington and Jefferson and Lincoln. Well, in some sense, have we turned them? Even when you look at their images, images, George Washington, he's shirtless, wearing toga, and his powdered wig. Shirtless. That he's appearing as a Zeus. He's appearing as a Greek god in a building that looks like a Greek temple. This is a civil theology. It is turning our politicians into gods. That would be a form of idolatry. I think because he didn't say it specifically, I think you could also then look at things like images of liberty, for example. Right? You can take some of the values as well within your civil society. Um, I think you could perhaps overemphasize them in such a way that you could create them into a civil theology too, right? Your soldiers and your generals and your, um, you can turn wars into theological dramas in some sense. If we're using any of the divine for the sake of a civil theology, this is kind of a nationalism, right? Christian nationalism could be a problem, right? If you turn it into a nationalism, it's a problem. If you use it as patriotism, well, that would be fine, right? Patriotism is a virtue, nationalism is a vice. To be proud of where you're from is fine, but to turn your nation into a theology becomes idolatry. The United States becomes an idol, then it's just as bad as any other idol, right? But being proud of where you're from does not necessarily make it an idol. It could be patriotism if it's done in the proper way. Now, idolatry is always a sin. Looking at Article 2, it's an outward worship of it's an outward worship. The outward worship is a sign of the inward worship. Now, what St. Thomas points to is in the first centuries when the Roman government forced Christians to, and forced everyone, to offer sacrifice before the idol statue of Caesar in order to show fidelity to the state. And Christians who did not, they said, I will not offer incense to recognize Caesar as God because he is not God. And they were martyred for standing up against that. There were other Christians who said, it's just a little bit of incense. Put the incense there, say the prayer, and walk away. It doesn't mean anything, right? you live another day to worship the one true God. Just, make them happy and move on with it. Well, so even some early bishops did that, right? And that created a tension within the early church where you had some faithful lay people, even women and elderly people, who were becoming martyrs while the bishop is hiding away, trying to save his own life. That created some problems within the church because the everyday Christians respected the martyrs greater than they respected the hierarchy of the church. So, this became a problem. Led to the heresy of Donatism. You can always look up if you don't know what Donatism is. What St. Thomas says is, and he reaffirms the church's teaching on that, the early church's view on that, is that you can't offer those, you can't offer the incense to the statue of Caesar and say the words of recognizing Caesar as God, and say, well, I just said that with words, but in my heart, I believe something else. Nope, the outward acts are a sign of the inward devotion, right? At the very least, not having enough reverence for the one true God, at the very least. Now, St. Thomas also brings up in the objections this idea of, for this article, I didn't really get a lot out of the St. Thomas's response. He's basically saying everything that was in the previous question is just, it's not a good excuse. It's not enough. Statues can be beautiful. You can't idolize them. Not an excuse. There's just no excuse. Idolatry is idolatry. So I think that's as far as you need to know. But in his response to objection 1, St. Thomas points out images within the church, and he even talks about the Old Testament under the Old Law, the tabernacle, and the objects within the Jewish temple. They were not set up for worship of latria, for the purpose of signification, in order that belief in excellence of angels and saints may be impressed and confirmed in the minds of men. That's a very important thing, and I think Protestants that pay attention anyway can be upset with Catholics when they walk in the church and they see, okay, there's a statue of Mary, there's a statue of Joseph, there's a statue of the patron saint of the church, you have probably Saint Therese somewhere, Saint Jude, Saint Anthony of Padua. Um, who knows how many, maybe another image of Mary in another part of the church. Stained glass windows of various saints. You could say, maybe if Vatican II they didn't destroy it, maybe images of angels painted in the sanctuary, uh, aiming at the altar. You could say, look at all these images. Yeah, there's a crucifix, but there's an awful lot of other stuff, right? Maybe uh, Catholics are worshiping these idols, especially if you see the candles lit before the image of the Blessed Mother or the saints. You could say, oh, these people are clearly worshiping these statues. But that if somebody is worshiping a statue, and we'll get to that in the question, um, that's not the purpose of the church putting it there. The purpose of the church putting it there is, is to inspire uh, living people, living Christians, to see them and aspire to the relationship that they had with God, to excel to excellence. You see images of the martyrs and the saints and the virgins and the holy patriarchs and things like that, and you aspire to become more like them. And I think there is an important psychology to this. There's been a number of psychological studies that show if you tell people, everybody's doing this, there was one study about littering. Everybody's littering. Be the one that doesn't litter. Well, that sounds like a good thing, right? Everybody's littering. Be the one who doesn't litter. Stand out. Be unique. you know, be different in a good way. Well, that sounds good. But what they found psychologically, people are more likely to buy into it if you're saying everyone's doing it, don't be the different one to go against it. So if you say, we're all, pitch in to do your part about litter, because we're all doing it, right? Everyone's throwing their trash in the trash can. Don't be the one to litter, right? Uh, People will be more likely to do it if they feel like everybody else is doing it. So, in some sense, there's a cultural dimension to our psychology where uh, if you were to say, Christ is so great, but he's different. He's different than us. Therefore, you should aspire to be like him. And all that you have is the image of the cross. You could say, I don't know if I'm strong enough to be like him. So there might not be even an attempt. Versus if you say, oh, I'm not sure I'm strong enough to be like him. Well, how about Saint Therese? She wasn't strong enough to be like him either. How about the Blessed Mother? How about Saint Joseph? Uh, how about Saint Jude? How about Saint Thomas the Doubter? How about Padre Pio? How about John Vianney? The list goes on and on and on. The more images, the more you say they all did it, right? Look at the hundreds have of images in this church that have gone before you, and they did it. Walk on this journey with them. Work on this journey with us. We are going. It's not you have to figure out how to do it on your own. You're doing it in great company, right? When you're physically in a church and you see all these images, you can kind of get a sense of this of like, do something grand, do something bold, take that great adventure. You won't be the first, but you'll have great company along the way, right? You're not doing it alone. That's more psychologically comforting to people. So I think there's an important element of that. That doesn't make it idolatry. It makes them your brothers and sisters on the journey. Um, and in some sense, Christ is also, the mystery of the incarnation, a brother on the journey, kind of leading the journey, but a brother on the journey to again to make us realize that we are not doing this alone. Christ is the example and the model. Now, idolatry is a grave sin, right? The question is it the most grievous sin? Well, it depends. In two ways you can look at it. In itself, it is the most grievous sin, right? To put another before God would be rather grievous. So something that goes against our neighbor indirectly offends God. Something that you do directly against God is more grievous than something that indirectly goes against God. Um, so in that regard, because you replace God with an element of creation, you have thrown off the proper justice due to God and thrown off the balance of the universe in a sense, as it's sometimes described. You are you put the universe in the wrong order. If that's in the wrong order, everything else is going to be in the wrong order. So in that, it is the gravest sin, right? If you were to think of it in human terms, what would be the greatest offense that a high-ranking general could uh, do in the military? It would be to be treasonous. It would be to give one's allegiance to a foreign nation. If head generals of the United States were to vow allegiance to Vladimir Putin and not to the President of the United States, um, that would be the most grievous thing that a high-ranking general could do, right? It threatens the the whole hierarchy of the military, right? If high-ranking military people are following Vladimir Putin and not the United States will fall. Um, Same thing with in terms of the kingdom of heaven, right? People are following the devil or creation or something else rather than God, then the kingdom is not the kingdom anymore. But the second way of looking at it is in the part of the sinner. Now, how grievous, how grave is the sin of idolatry? It kind of depends on the intent of the person a little bit as well. So, um, if a person, let's say, missionaries go out someplace that has not been properly Christianized, maybe that's a thing of the past, but going out to a place where there has been no Christian missionaries before, not effectively anyway, and they are worshiping ancestor idols or worshiping in some way. Well, they're not doing it out of contempt for God. They're in their own way being religious. They're in their own way attempting to show honor to the ancestors, God, however it is, whatever they're doing. They're attempting something good. All right. And there's something innate within us which calls us to offer something to God and sacrifice. This is natural law, as St. Thomas has pointed out. As part of natural law, we want to sacrifice. We want to give oblation to the divine. So if people have not yet heard the good news of Christ, the way in which they do this is going to be incorrect. Right? But their attempt is not wicked. Their action is still wrong. It's still misguided. You can't say, well, the sacrifice offered to Baal is the same as the sacrifice offered to the God of the one true God. Baal is not the one true God, therefore it would be incorrect. But is not the attempt was not wicked by the part of the people. Therefore, it's not the most grievous. Now, if one attempts to do it as a form of contempt, then that would be different. So if somebody was Christian and they decided, you can see this sometimes with Satanism, and I suspect some of this has to do with mental illness of some of the people who do it. Um, but somebody was raised Christian, Catholic, and uh, they decide they're going to take a cross and put it upside down and put an image of the devil there until they're going to be devil worshippers. Again, I suspect that some of this might be mental illness, but it's completely against rationality to do such a thing. It's completely irrational. But some people still do it. Um, One might be worshiping the devil in contempt of God. Right? They're doing it deliberately in contempt of God. Well, then that would be uh, wrong. right? That would be the most grievous. That would be very grievous. Uh, now, if somebody perhaps taken on the Buddha or something like that as an idol, we think that the Buddhists don't worship Buddha as an idol, but some if they do, if you do worship the Buddha as an idol or any other god, Hindu god, um, you could. The degree is to the degree in which it's contempt and not ignorance. I think it's a fair enough uh, assessment, and it is grievous and it is grave, but one must also look at the intent. Um, Now, the causes of idolatry they're interesting and I enjoy them. There's twofold causes. The dispositive, which is perhaps a more interesting one. Um, Inordinate affections can create idolatry. And now the example given is, let's say a father has a son who died, and they make a statue of the son, and the son becomes almost idolized. Okay, particularly the image becomes idolized. You see the young pope or the new pope with John Malkovich, where his parents have kind of created a shrine to his brother who died, and they sit by his grave all day, and at night they sit by the shrine they built in the house of images of him and some of his stuff. This has created an idolatry to the lost son, the lost child. Right? It's gone too far. It's gone too far. Could happen with any loved grandparent, and you kind of build a shrine to them in the house, and you light candles in front of their image, and you go in front of it and you pray. To one degree, it's fine. To another degree, depending on intention, it can be too far, right, in terms of idolatry. Um, Natural pleasures in representation is another one, and maybe could be one of the more common ones, uh, where this comes up. Well, this doesn't come up. This is where it comes up. The image I think of this is something like the Pietà, that the work of the master, the artist, is so great that it not only inspires one spiritually towards God, but people have fallen in love with the object itself to a certain degree. All right. Some of the great churches, they should all be pointing towards God, right? But you can also see, if you ever go to Europe in particular, some of the most beautiful churches, you have people who are atheists, people who are tourists, and they're walking around, they're taking pictures, and they're admiring the art for the art's sake, but they're not being their souls are not being directed towards internal devotion towards God. They, how many people are trying to get into at the time Notre Dame Cathedral because they want to pray? Some of these great churches, they kind of have blocked off an area with glass so people who actually want to pray could go in and pray. And for everybody else, they kind of wander around and are taking photographs and they're talking loudly. And it's people have confused the creation with what it's supposed to be directing us towards. That would be natural pleasures. And then lastly, ignorance. I call this ignorance. And it's looking at the excellence of creatures. You used to look at a lion and you see their beauty and their power. So to turn, something so beautiful into an idol, well, you could see how ignorant people could do that. People who don't know any better, people who are not been exposed to the fullness of the truth could be uh, drawn to the beauty of creation, which, right, in the proper order, you would say that tiger or lion is really beautiful. Look at the majesty of it. Look at the beauty of it. Look at the power behind it. Look at the skill. Look at everything about that lion or tiger. It's phenomenal. Clearly, it was created by a good God, right? Right. If you only say, well, oh, it's just evolution, right? It's just the way it is. That doesn't give honor to God either. But to say, um, look at the magnificence of it. God must be really great. That's the proper order. If you look at the animal and you start worshiping it, now you've misdirected your cause. But that would then be ignorance. So again, it would be inordinate affections, loving the work of art, or loving the creation too much rather than what they're supposed to be pointing us towards. And lastly, uh, is the idolatry which is formed by demons, right? So demons could also inspire us to worship false idols in order to detract us from proper worship to God. Right? If we properly are worshiping God, the devil gets upset by that. So instead of making us not worship anything, could be harder, you have people worship something that's false. It's easier to get people to. It's easier to misguide people than it is for them to turn them entirely around. It's for somebody to become a hardened atheist, it could be a lot of work, but to just slightly misguide them is easier. So, kind of a judo approach to the devil. So, conclusion: idolatry is a species of superstition. It's a form of superstition. It's a form of religious excess. Um, Idolatry is a sin. There are many reasons why uh, this Article 4. There are many causes of idolatry, and not all with bad intentions, but it is always a sin because it is not giving God what is due to God. It is giving what is due to God to something else. And idolatry, because of that, because it goes against the glory of God, it can be the gravest sin, right? In itself, it is the greatest sin, but not everyone necessarily is doing it for that purpose. That's all we have for this lesson, and we'll move forward with divinization, which is next.